He spent 20 years standing in front of teenagers who weren't listening. 20 years of chalk dust and disrespect, of being the punchline before he even opened his mouth. A man who helped win a Nobel Prize, reduced to a name nobody in that classroom could be bothered to remember correctly. And the terrifying part isn't that it happened to him. The terrifying part is that nobody noticed it happening at all. That's the part everyone gets wrong about danger. We think the dangerous ones are loud, easy to spot from across a room. We think we'll see them coming from a mile away, but the man who becomes the most lethal person in the room is usually the one everyone stopped looking at years ago. This is Walter White's story, but it isn't really about him. Before there was Heisenberg, there was a man who used to matter. He studied chemistry at Caltech alongside his closest friend, the two of them building research that helped a team win a Nobel Prize before he had even finished graduate school. He co-founded a company from scratch with that same friend, a company built on his name, his work, his mind. He fell in love with a lab assistant there too, someone sharp enough to keep up with him, someone he was supposed to marry. Then days before that engagement was meant to become official, he walked away from all of it. The relationship, the research, the company he had built with his own hands. He sold his share of it for $5,000 and disappeared into an ordinary life, telling anyone who asked that it was personal and refusing to explain further. The company he helped build went on to become worth over $2 billion. The man who built it went on to teach high school chemistry to kids who could barely be bothered to learn his name correctly. That's the gap. On one side, a man who could have been one of the wealthiest scientists in the country. A man whose name should have been on patents and research papers people still cite. On the other, a man standing in a high school parking lot counting out exact change at a car wash on the weekend because his teaching salary wasn't enough to keep his family afloat. Somewhere between those two men, a whole life went missing, and nobody, including him, ever fully said out loud where it went. Most people who watch his story focus on the cancer diagnosis as the moment everything changed. It wasn't. The diagnosis was just the spark, the excuse he'd been waiting 20 years for. The fuel had been sitting there the whole time, untouched, waiting for permission. Every person carries one wound that explains everything else they do. For this man, it wasn't the company, it wasn't even the $5,000, it was what he did with the story afterward. He rewrote it, quietly, patiently, for 2 decades, until the version in his head bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened. In his version, he was cheated, robbed, pushed out by people who didn't deserve what they built. He needed that version to survive because the real one was unbearable. The real one was that he left on his own, that he was the one who walked away from his own greatness because his pride couldn't survive being the smaller person in the room. A man can live with bad luck, he can live with injustice. What he cannot live with is the idea that he did it to himself. So he didn't carry that idea, he buried it under a different one, and he carried that one instead for 20 years until it calcified into something that no longer felt like a story at all. It felt like the truth. That's what made the wound so dangerous. It wasn't bleeding, it had scarred over wrong, healed in a shape that no longer matched the original injury. Every time his old partners showed up in the news for another donation or another award, the scar pulled tight again. He smiled through it, he congratulated them, and underneath the smile, the rewritten version of events kept getting rehearsed, kept getting sharper, kept becoming more convincing to the one person it was designed to convince, himself. That is the moment the danger starts, not when someone is wronged. When someone convinces themselves they were wronged and builds an entire identity around proving it. Remember the gap, the space between who he was supposed to be and who he actually became. That gap didn't stay still. Every year he spent rewriting the story, the gap got a little wider, a little harder to look at directly, until looking away from it became the only thing he knew how to do. Think about the version of this happening in an office instead of a chemistry lab. The employee who trained the new hire that eventually got promoted over them. The one who watches someone less capable get the title, the raise, the recognition, while their own name slides quietly off the list of people anyone thinks to ask. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small withdrawals, fewer meetings they're invited to, fewer messages that get a reply, a slow demotion in everyone else's mental org chart that never shows up on paper, but is felt every single day. They keep showing up. They keep doing the work. They keep telling themselves that good work is supposed to be enough, that someone is bound to notice eventually. And somewhere in there, a quiet decision gets made that nobody else in the room even notices being made. The decision isn't dramatic. It's small. It sounds like, fine, if this is what being good gets me, I'll stop being good. Nobody hears that sentence out loud. That's exactly why it's the most dangerous sentence a person can think. You can see it in smaller rooms too. The kid in the family who was never the favorite, who watched a sibling get praised for the same effort that earned him silence. The partner who carried a relationship for years while the other one took credit for holding it together. The friend who organized everything, remembered every birthday, and realized one day that nobody had ever once organized anything for them. None of these people look dangerous. They look tired. That's the disguise. Invisibility doesn't look like a threat. It looks like someone quietly disappearing into the background of their own life. And that's precisely why nobody sees what's building underneath it until it's already standing in the doorway. I know this one personally. There was a stretch of years where I built things for other other people and watch my name get left off every single one of them, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way people forget to thank the person who isn't in the room anymore by the time the credit gets handed out. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself the work spoke for itself. But somewhere underneath that, something else was keeping count. Every quiet erasure, every missing mention, every time someone said we when they meant me. I wasn't bitter. I told myself that for years. I was just keeping score, waiting for a moment to finally cash it in. Not bitter, counting. That's the trap. Feeling invisible doesn't make a person harmless. It makes them patient. And patience sitting untouched for 20 years inside someone who feels owed something doesn't fade. It compounds. By the time this man stood in his own kitchen and told his wife exactly who she was talking to, the timeline of his ego, the company he could have run, the money that should have been his, all of it came out in one breath, like it had been rehearsed for 2 decades because it had been. He told her a business big enough to be listed on the stock exchange would collapse without him. He told her she had no idea who she was talking to, and when she suggested someone might come looking for him one day, he said the 4 words that ended whatever version of him used to exist. I am the one who knocks. That sentence didn't come from nowhere. It came from 20 years of being the one who got knocked on. Every slight, every overlooked contribution, every moment of being underestimated, fermenting quietly until it turned into something that needed an outlet. He found his outlet in becoming the exact thing he used to fear walking into his own home. Near the very end, after everything had been lost, after the family that justification was supposedly protecting had been destroyed by the protecting itself, he finally said the truest sentence he'd spoken in years. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was really alive. Not for his family, not for justice, for the simple addictive relief of finally being seen as dangerous instead of disposable. That's the real warning underneath this whole story. It was never really about meth or empire or the chemistry of any of it. It was about what happens when a brilliant person spends decades being told quietly and constantly that they don't matter, and they believe it just long enough to decide they'll make sure nobody ever makes that mistake again. Look at the gap one last time. It never closed. Even at the very end, standing in a lab that wasn't his, surrounded by money that couldn't buy back 20 years, the distance between who he was supposed to be and who he became was still exactly as wide as the day he sold his name for $5,000. He just stopped trying to close it and started weaponizing it instead. Somewhere right now, someone is sitting in a meeting they weren't really invited into, nodding along, keeping score, telling themselves they don't care, they're not dangerous yet, but they're collecting the evidence. The clock on a quiet person's patience is always running. You rarely hear it tick until the door is already open,